What happens when someone dares to challenge Jesus? What if I told you that a young man dared to challenge Jesus in a way that no one had ever had the courage to do? An unexpected encounter, an audacious question, and an answer that would change everything. Imagine standing before the one many called the Messiah, and instead of bowing down, raising your voice and challenging him. What happened at that moment? What would have led this young man to act this way? And most importantly, what was Jesus' reaction? The sun beat down on the stone streets, while dust rose with each hurried step of the crowd. People jostled to get closer. Anxious eyes sought to see the face of the man who so many said was the Son of God. There were murmurs, whispers, excited voices discussing miracles and teachings. But in the crowd, one young man remained different. His gaze was fixed, his expression hard, filled with a mix of skepticism and boldness. He was not there to seek healing or hear comforting words. He wanted something more. I wanted answers, but not like the others. He wanted to test it. He wanted to expose what he believed to be a hoax. He made his way through the people, curious gazes turning to him. Some whispered, others just watched, intrigued by what was about to happen. Then, in front of everyone, he raised his voice. If you really are who you say you are, prove it. Show me something that no one can question. Say something that will convince me that you are unlike any other preacher who has ever walked this earth. Silence took over the place. The disciples looked at each other, some ready to intervene. But Jesus showed no surprise or indignation. His gaze fell on the young man, as if he could see something beyond the words, beyond the provocation. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there, watching, allowing the weight of that moment to intensify. The crowd held its breath. Some expected a miracle, others expected a rebuke. The young man, in turn, held his gaze, but something inside him began to waver. Why didn't Jesus react as others would? Why didn't he try to justify himself or prove his authority? The tension in the air was almost palpable. Then, finally, Jesus opened his lips to speak. Now, before revealing what happened, imagine yourself in this young man's place. If you were standing before Jesus, would you have the courage to challenge him? What would you ask him? How do you think he would respond? Comment below and share your vision. Your answer may bring a new perspective to this story, but be careful. What comes next may change your view of this encounter in an unexpected way. Then, don't miss the outcome of this story. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters. You're about to discover something few know about. The young man did not come to Jesus by chance. Ever since he heard about the Nazarene, something inside him had been uneasy. He had already heard stories about miraculous cures, words that changed lives, and teachings that challenged the wise men of the time. But he was not someone who accepted something without question. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He wanted to test that man, see if he really was different from the other masters who had already passed through his city. So, when he heard that Jesus was near, he did not hesitate. Deep down, he didn't know if he wanted an answer or just to prove that it was all a mistake. The heat was intense. The sun burned the dusty streets while the buzz grew among the people. Men, women, children, everyone crowded together, eager to see Jesus, hoping perhaps for a miracle or a word of hope. Some whispered about the Master's achievements. Others simply tried to get closer to see better. The energy in the air was electric, a mix of anticipation and awe. But the young man did not share this devotion. He observed everything with critical eyes, arms crossed, as if analyzing every detail, looking for a flaw, a contradiction. When he finally saw Jesus, his heart quickened, but he refused to admit any emotion other than skepticism. The man in front of him didn't look extraordinary. His clothes were simple, his countenance was serene, and even surrounded by so many, he seemed fully aware of each person around. There was something about his presence that was difficult to explain, but the young man ignored this impression and moved forward. He didn't want to be One of the crowd, he wanted to be the one who would publicly challenge him. Approaching, he raised his voice for everyone to hear. His tone was firm, full of arrogance and a slight provocation. He wanted to see if Jesus would react like the other teachers, if he would try to justify himself, or if he would use empty words to avoid confrontation. The crowd slowly fell silent, forming a natural circle around the two. Jesus' disciples looked at each other, attentive to what would happen next. Some seemed worried, others were just waiting for the master's response. The more skeptical in the crowd moved closer, eager to see how Jesus would handle a direct challenge. The young man felt the eyes on him, but he didn't back away. His pride held him back. He wanted a clash. He wanted something that would justify his disbelief. But what happened next was nothing like he expected. The silence lasted for an uncomfortable time. Jesus just watched him, not with disapproval or indignation, but with a deep look, as if he saw something beyond the surface. The lack of an immediate response bothered the young man more than any words could have done. He didn't understand why Jesus didn't react like the other teachers, why he didn't defend himself, didn't argue. The weight of that look made him swallow hard. The crowd held its breath. Some expected Jesus to rebuke him. Others expected a miracle that would silence any doubts. But Jesus was still there, calm, serene, waiting. The young man felt a chill down his spine, but maintained his pose. He could not show hesitation, so he insisted. "And then, have nothing to say? Don't you defend yourself? Or do you know you can't prove who you really are?" Jesus finally took a deep breath, but still did not speak. The wind blew lightly, lifting some of the dust from the ground. The young man felt a strange discomfort. That silence seemed to echo inside him, bringing an uneasiness that he couldn't name. Then something changed. Jesus' gaze intensified, and finally he opened his lips to speak. The young man felt the weight of Jesus' gaze on him, but he did not back down. On the contrary, he straightened his shoulders, raised his chin, and decided to press it even more. The surrounding crowd watched in silence, some with looks of expectation, others of disapproval. Among the disciples, there were those who frowned, fearing that the young man's audacity might be punished with harsh words. But Jesus did not show anger or impatience. He just waited. The young man took a deep breath and took a step forward. He wanted to expose Jesus. He wanted everyone to see that the man many called the Messiah was no different from the other preachers who had passed by before. If he was really the Son of God, as so many said, then let him prove it there in front of everyone. If you are as powerful as they claim, if you really have the authority they say, then show me a sign. His voice echoed across the open space, reaching the ears of every person there. Perform a miracle now in front of us all, something no one can deny. If you are the chosen one, you shouldn't hesitate. Or are you afraid of being unmasked? The crowd murmured. Some looked at each other, others shook their heads in disapproval. Who was that young man to challenge Jesus like that? It wasn't the first time someone had asked the master for signs, but there was something different at that moment. It was not a plea for faith, it was not a plea for hope, but rather a direct challenge, full of arrogance and incredulity. An elderly man, leaning against a nearby wall, shook his head and muttered to himself, "He doesn't know who he's talking to." The disciples were tense. Peter clenched his fists, as if ready to intervene if Jesus was insulted further. Jerome, by his side, just watched, his gaze fixed on the master, waiting to see how he would respond. Silence was heavy in the air, filled with expectation, but Jesus didn't seem bothered. His gaze remained serene, impenetrable. He knew that this young man was not looking for the truth, but rather a way to prove to himself and others that none of it was real. He saw beyond the words, beyond the defiance, beyond the arrogance. He saw the heart of that young man. He saw the doubts he tried to hide behind his boldness. The young man expected an immediate response, but Jesus did not rush. He allowed the silence to grow, for each person there to feel the tension of the moment. The young man impatiently opened his arms and laughed, trying to hide his discomfort. What it was, he insisted with a challenging smile. Have you lost your voice, master? Or do you have nothing to say? The wind blew strongly, raising dust between the sandals of those present. Some squinted, shielding themselves from the dust, but Jesus was still motionless, as if he didn't even notice the wind, as if he knew something bigger was about to happen. I heard that you are capable of healing the sick, continued the young man, who makes the blind see, who multiplies bread and fish. So do something now, in front of everyone. Prove that you are what they say. The crowd was divided. Some murmured, agreeing with the young man. Others just watched, waiting for the scene to unfold. There were those who wanted to see a miracle and those who expected a severe rebuke. But what would Jesus do? The young man took another step, reducing the distance between him and Jesus. My heart beat faster, but not because of the emotion of faith, but because of the desire to win that battle. He wanted Jesus to react, to do something so he could fight back. Or maybe he hesitated, and a mocking smile appeared on his face. Maybe you're just a fake, someone who hides behind pretty words and stories to fool fools. The crowd sighed. Some gasped. This was too much. Who would dare call Jesus a fake? A heavy silence fell over everyone, and at that moment, even the wind ceased. Jesus' eyes remained fixed on the young man, but something changed. It wasn't anger nor indignation. It was as if, in that moment, he saw not just the challenge, but the true pain that lurked behind it. But before I continue this story, I want to know, have you ever found yourself in a moment where you needed a sign to believe in Jesus? Have you ever challenged your faith in search of an answer? Comment below and share your experience. Your comment is essential for this message to reach thousands of people. This story has something powerful to reveal to you. Make sure you don't miss this meeting. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue this experience. Now get ready, because Jesus' answer may be very different from what you imagine. The young man, who until then felt in control of the situation, began to feel strange. Something about that look disturbed him. It wasn't a look of judgment, but of something he couldn't explain. For the first time, he felt a different doubt. What was he really trying to prove? Was it about Jesus or about himself? The prolonged silence made the young man feel slight discomfort. Some people in the crowd began to whisper, wondering if the master would respond in any way. But Jesus was in no hurry. He was not like the teachers of the law, who used quick words to refute questions. He didn't need justification. His look alone spoke volumes. The young man tried to hold his gaze, but something inside him began to waver. He felt like he was facing someone different. He wanted to prove that Jesus was just another one, but deep down he felt he couldn't. What was happening to him? Jesus then took a deep breath and took a small step forward. The crowd became tense. Everyone expected a miracle, an impressive answer, something that would shut the young man up once and for all. But Jesus' response was nothing like they expected. The crowd held its breath as the young man waited impatiently, waiting for an answer that never seemed to come. The seconds dragged by like hours, and the silence around him seemed to echo inside his mind. He expected Jesus to defend himself, to try to prove something with grandiose words or a show of power. But what came next took him by surprise. Jesus looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something deeper. His voice sounded calm as a serene river, but carrying an authority that didn't need to be imposed. Why do you ask for a sign if your eyes are open and you still cannot see? The young man frowned, not knowing how to respond immediately. He didn't expect a question in return. I expected a defense, a justification. But Jesus, as always, spoke in a way that made the soul stir before the mind could even understand. The crowd began to murmur. Some nodded as if understanding the depth of the answer, while others exchanged confused looks. The young man, however, felt something strange inside him, as if his certainties were beginning to crumble. He opened his mouth to retort, but words failed him. For the first time, he found himself without arguments. Jesus stepped forward and continued, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the waters proclaim his power, the sun rises and sets without anyone commanding it, and yet you ask for a sign? The wind blows and you do not see it, but you feel its presence. Such is the truth. It is before you, but your heart is still reluctant to accept it." The young man felt a tightness in his chest. He had expected something great, an undeniable miracle that would crush any doubt, but instead he received words that shook his insides. He looked around, seeing attentive faces, eyes fixed on the two of them. He felt he needed to respond, that he couldn't allow Jesus to have the last word. But what about those who don't see? His voice was weaker than he intended. How can you believe without proof? Jesus tilted his head slightly, as if he saw something beyond the question. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet have believed. His voice sounded like a whisper that reverberated in the soul. The young man felt a wave of discomfort and anger mixed together. That wasn't fair. He had come to question, to expose Jesus, but now he was the one who felt exposed. His hands were shaking, and he realized he didn't know if it was from anger or something deeper. The crowd remained silent, absorbing the master's every word. The disciples watched attentively, some smiling discreetly, as they knew that Jesus never reacted as expected. But the young man was not yet ready to give in. His pride wouldn't allow it. He crossed his arms and laughed nervously. "So that's how it is? Do you have nothing but words? You won't do anything to prove who you are?" Jesus looked at him with compassion. "Proofs are given to those who seek with their hearts, not to those who challenge with their lips." His tone was not scolding, but truthful. The young man felt the response like an invisible blow, something that went through his barriers and went straight to his core. The wind blew, kicking up a whirlwind of dust all around. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, absorbing every moment of the silent confrontation. Jesus did not need to raise his voice or make grand gestures. His presence was enough to shake that young man's convictions, but he couldn't give in, not yet. There was something inside him that refused to accept what seemed so obvious to others. "You're good with words, but words don't prove anything," the young man said, trying to regain his confidence. "Who can guarantee that you're not just another prophet like so many others? If you really are who they say, prove it with something undeniable." Jesus gave a small smile, but not mockingly. It was a smile of understanding, as if he knew exactly what was going on inside the young man, even if he didn't know it himself. "You want a sign, but you will not perceive it when it is before you. For those who close their eyes will never see, even if the light is before them." The crowd began to move restlessly, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. The young man wanted to argue. He wanted a definitive answer, but all he received were words that seemed to pierce his reason and directly touch his soul. He realized that he could no longer hold Jesus' gaze. He looked away, trying to find support in the crowd, but only found looks that reflected the same question that now weighed on him. "Why do you talk about riddles?" His voice now no longer had the firmness it had before. "If you want me to believe, tell me clearly who you are and show me something that cannot be refuted." Jesus took a deep breath and slowly raised his hand, pointing to the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "Look at the sky. The day leaves without anyone ordering it, and the night arrives without being called. Time moves because it was determined by the Father. So are those who believe. They don't need to see to know that what is real is before them." The young man looked up at the sky, and for a brief moment he felt something inside him tremble, but he refused to admit it. Not yet. The weight of Jesus' words was something he couldn't ignore, but he also didn't want to accept. The crowd remained silent. The wind blew gently, rustling the cloaks of those around. Some began to whisper among themselves, trying to understand the meaning of Jesus' words. Others simply waited, as if they knew that the moment had not yet ended. The young man felt the weight of everyone's expectations on him. He wanted to react. He wanted to say something that would regain control of the situation, but he couldn't. Jesus continued to stand still, looking at him patiently. His gaze showed no haste, no provocation, just absolute calm, as if he knew that the real battle was not between the two, but within the young man himself. A dense silence settled in, and the young man's heart was beating fast. It was as if the entire universe was waiting for his next word. But before I continue this story, I want to know, have you ever been in a moment where you needed proof to believe? Have you ever felt that, deep down, the answer you were looking for was always there, but you were reluctant to see it? Comment below and share your experience. Your comment is essential for this message to reach thousands of people who are in need of a word that touches their hearts and brings new understanding. Now get ready, because what happens next could change everything. Young man opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was buzzing with conflicting thoughts. He expected a clash, an argument that he could refute, a justification that he could question. But Jesus' words were not like those of the teachers of the law, full of detours and interpretations. They were direct, cutting, and seemed to go deeper than he cared to admit. His heart was beating fast, and for the first time he felt small in front of that man. The surrounding crowd remained silent for a moment, absorbing every detail of the scene. The wind blew lightly, making the dust dance across the ground, and looks alternated between Jesus and the young man, awaiting his reaction. Some murmured amongst themselves, others just watched, fascinated by what they were witnessing. Among the disciples, Peter narrowed his eyes, analyzing the boy's every movement, while John showed a small smile, as if he already knew what was coming. The young man, however, felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence that was becoming increasingly suffocating. But Jesus' words echoed within him, challenging not just his intelligence, but something deeper, something he had tried to ignore for a long time. He felt his muscles tense, his hands clenched into fists, but nothing seemed capable of containing the avalanche of emotions that were forming inside him. So, his voice was lower than he intended, almost a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, this time more firmly. "So you mean I'm blind, that I can't see what's in front of me?" Jesus kept his gaze fixed on him, without haste, without accusation, just with that calm that disarmed any resistance. "Many have eyes, but do not see. Many have ears, but do not hear." His voice was soft, but carried with a weight that the young man couldn't ignore. The crowd murmured. Some people nodded, as if they understood the depth of those words. Others looked at each other, waiting to see how the young man would react. An elderly man in the middle of the group sighed, as if he had faced that same dilemma at some point in his life. The young man felt heat rise to his face. He didn't want to accept that. I didn't want to be reduced to someone who didn't see the truth. But deep down, something inside him was beginning to crumble. The doubts he thought he had under control began to spread, like cracks in a solid wall. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself right that he never considered the possibility that he was wrong. "But if I really don't see, how can I see?" His question came out before he could stop it. It was a sincere request, almost a plea, even though he tried to disguise his vulnerability. Jesus took a deep breath and took a small step forward. The truth is not imposed. It reveals itself to those who want to see it. What you are looking for is not in signs or proofs, but in what is inside you. Close your eyes to the world and open your heart. Then you will see. The young man felt a shiver run down his spine. He wanted to resist, he wanted to continue the fight, but there was something in those words that resonated within him. Something that made sense in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. The crowd remained silent, as if they were all stuck with the same question. The wind blew, kicking up some dust into the air. The young man looked around, looking for support in unfamiliar faces, but found only looks of expectation and curiosity. The weight of the situation was beginning to fall on him. For once, he was not the challenger. He was the challenged one. He squinted his eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to regain his composure. If the truth is within me, then why don't I see it? His voice carried a mix of frustration and despair, and the question seemed to echo in his own mind. Jesus smiled slightly, not mockingly, but patiently. Because your heart still resists. Because you seek. Outside what can only be found within. You look outside when you should look inside. The young man felt a knot tighten in his chest. It made sense, but at the same time, it was uncomfortable. He always believed that truth should be something concrete, something visible, something that could be touched or tasted. But Jesus spoke of something different, something he didn't know if he was ready to accept. The crowd began to murmur again. Some people nodded, as if they were seeing a reflection of themselves in that conversation. Others remained silent, waiting to see what the young man's reaction would be. He felt anticipation building around him, as if everyone was waiting for him to make a decision. His fists were clenched, his shoulders rigid. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to find a flaw in Jesus' logic, but he couldn't. He felt his breathing heavy, his mind working at full speed, but the answers he was looking for didn't come. Jesus took another step forward, further reducing the distance between the two. His eyes penetrated the young man's, as if seeing beyond the surface. You seek answers, but you fear what you might find. Your fear is not of doubt, it is of the truth. His words were soft, but cutting like a sharp blade. The young man felt a shiver run down his spine. His instinct screamed to retreat, to counterattack, but something inside him stopped him. His pride was fighting something bigger, something he couldn't name. He swallowed hard, and for a brief moment, he felt the urge to run away, but I couldn't. Something kept him trapped. Jesus waited. He didn't pressure, he didn't impose, he just waited. The young man realized that the choice was his, always out, and at that moment, he was faced with the most difficult decision of his life. The young man felt his heart accelerate. Something inside him was changing, but he still fought against it. His mind screamed that he couldn't give in, that he must stand his ground. All his life, he had learned that only fools believed without proof. But now, before Jesus, he felt that the truth he sought so much could not be touched or measured. It needed to be felt. The crowd still watched in silence. Some whispered among themselves, others just waited, caught up in the tension of that moment. Jesus' disciples remained alert, as they had seen this look before, the look of someone about to be transformed. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. He felt vulnerable, and that irritated him. I didn't want to show weakness. He took a deep breath, and when he opened his eyes again, he found Jesus' gaze fixed on him, but without judgment. There was patience, understanding, and something he had never seen in anyone before: unconditional love. He started to speak, but his voice trailed off. He cleared his throat and tried again. I just wanted to understand. Jesus took a small step forward. Understanding with reason will not always lead you to the truth. What you are really looking for is beyond what the eyes can see. Are you willing to see? The young man hesitated. The question was simple, but it carried a weight he didn't know if he was ready to bear. Why did I feel so afraid? Why did the idea of giving in to faith terrify him more than anything else? For years, he had prided himself on his intelligence, his ability to question everything. But now, before Jesus, he realized that knowledge without humility was an empty path. The crowd was barely breathing. Everyone was waiting for the outcome of that moment. Some smiled discreetly, recognizing in the young man the same internal struggle they once had. Others just watched, eager to know what his answer would be. He looked down, feeling the weight of his own doubts. For the first time, he allowed himself to be honest with himself. "I'm afraid," he admitted in a whisper. "Fear of being wrong. Fear of discovering that everything I believed until now wasn't enough." Jesus nodded slowly, as if he already knew this. The truth does not require fear, but rather surrender. You don't need to understand everything right away. Just allow yourself to see. Something inside the young man broke. It was as if a wall he had built over the years was beginning to crumble, brick by brick. His pride screamed at him to back down, to hold his ground, but his heart asked him to take a step forward. The wind blew gently, as if following what was happening. The crowd began to move. Slightly, feeling the change in the air, the young man closed his eyes once again, but now it wasn't to avoid the truth. It was to accept it. He tried to speak again, but his voice broke. He took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to continue. "What if I'm not ready?" he asked sincerely. Jesus smiled, a calm and welcoming smile. "No one is ready alone. But when you choose to see, the truth guides you. You need not fear." Those words found a deep place within the young man. He realized that he didn't need to have all the answers, that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel instead of simply questioning. The crowd watched intently. Some were emotional, others seemed to reflect on their own journeys. Pedro looked at João and smiled slightly. They knew they were witnessing something special. The young man looked up at Jesus and, without realizing it, took a step forward. His heart was still beating fast, but now it was for a different reason. He didn't know what would come next, but for once he was willing to find out. The silence was broken by a light sound of footsteps. The young man looked to his side and saw an elderly man in the crowd nodding at him, as if to say he understood his struggle. Some tears shone in that old man's eyes, as if he recognized his own story at that moment. I always looked for answers," confessed the young man, his voice full of emotion. "I always wanted to find something that gave me absolute certainty. But now I realize that perhaps certainty is not in what I see, but in what I feel." Jesus tilted his head slightly, as if encouraging that thought. Faith is not built on proof, but on trust. You were looking for a sign, but here is something greater than a sign, a choice. The young man swallowed. He understood. For the first time he understood. Change is not always easy, but sometimes it is necessary. Have you ever experienced a moment when you felt afraid of changing? Have you ever had to confront your own beliefs to see a greater truth? Comment below and share your experience. Your comment is essential for this message to reach thousands of people who need this reflection. Now get ready, because what happens next could transform everything. How many times in our lives have we found ourselves in the same position as that young man, questioning, doubting, demanding signs, concrete proof that God is with us? In times of trouble, we look to the sky and ask, "If you are really here, then show me a sign." But are we prepared to recognize the answer when it arrives? Are we listening with our hearts? The young man in our story wanted proof. He wanted something that would eliminate any doubt, that would be undeniable in his eyes. But Jesus, with his infinite wisdom, showed that true faith is not based on visible signs, but on trust in the invisible. Faith is not built on the absolute certainty of the eyes, but on the absolute certainty of the heart. We live in an era where we want everything yesterday. We seek immediate answers. We want proof before taking a step forward. But are we really opening our hearts to the answer God gives us? How many times has He spoken to us through small gestures, unexpected encounters, words from a friend, and we still don't realize it? The young man in the story needed to strip away his pride, his need to control everything, to finally see. And us? What stops us from seeing? Could it be fear? Pride? The need for exact answers to everything? Maybe it's time to stop, take a deep breath and listen. Not with your ears, but with your heart. God does not need to prove anything to us. He has already given us everything. Life, love, hope. but it's up to us to decide if we want to see it. As Jesus said to the young man, "Close your eyes to the world and open your heart. Then you will see." That's the big lesson. It is not the signs that lead us to faith, but the faith that allows us to recognize the signs. If we stop to think, we will see that our lives are full of moments when God calls us to trust. Sometimes He doesn't give us what we ask for, but what we need. And we often only understand this later. The young man's journey was not just about challenging Jesus. It was about learning to trust, about realizing that love and truth don't need to be proven, just accepted. Just like the young man, how many times do we let our doubts stop us from seeing what is in front of us? We worry so much about questioning, challenging, demanding signs that we forget that the answer can be found in small things. In the hug of someone who loves us, in the right word at the right time, in the simple fact that we wake up every day with a new opportunity. Faith is not about seeing first and then believing. It's about believing and then seeing. And when we decide to trust, when we choose to open our hearts, we begin to realize that God has always been there, guiding us, supporting us, showing us the way, even when we insisted on not seeing it. What if, in the end, the great answer we seek is not in the proofs we want, but in the peace we find in trusting? What if, like the young man, we have to let down our walls and simply accept that there is something greater than our need for control? We look at this young man's story and see a reflection of our own journey. Each of us at some point has been faced with a similar dilemma. We question God when things don't go our way. We feel abandoned when difficulties arise. But are we not blind to what really matters in these moments? Has God not already given us everything we need, but we are not willing to see it? Think about times in your life when everything seemed confusing. Now look back. How many of these difficulties brought essential learning? How many times has a closed door led to an even better path? God works in ways that we often don't understand in the moment, but that makes sense later. If we trust, if we allow ourselves to see beyond our own expectations, we will realize that He has always been with us. The peace we seek is not in immediate answers, but in the certainty that God has already traced the right path. And you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation similar to this young man? Have you ever doubted, questioned, or waited for a clear sign from God, but ended up finding answers in a way you didn't expect? Many times we look for something great, an obvious miracle, a revelation that removes all our doubts. But God works in subtle, silent ways, and as this young man learned, the true sign is not always in front of the eyes, but within the heart. Sometimes the answer we ask for is already in front of us, but we are too busy trying to fit God into our own expectations. What if instead of questioning, we learn to trust? If instead of demanding proof, we learn to listen? The great lesson that Jesus gives us is not about receiving signs, but about realizing that faith is the key to seeing what is already there. The young man in this story had to face his own barriers, his pride, his fears. He wanted to challenge Jesus, but in the end, he was the one who found himself challenged. And this is also our reality. What stops us from taking this step? What stops us from believing, trusting, opening our hearts to something bigger than ourselves? Now imagine for a moment, what if it were you in this young man's place? What would your reaction have been? Would I have insisted on seeing a sign, or would I have been able to see the truth beyond appearances? Share your vision in the comments, as your words can bring valuable reflections to thousands of people. And this story was just the beginning. There is another encounter with Jesus that few know about, and what happened there reveals something transformative. Great discoveries await you. So continue this experience and make sure you're present for the next video on our channel, The Hidden Stories of Jesus.